and I don't know how often this is actually like put this way by atheists, but it's the way that I've got it here is just evolution disproves God.
Well
is a very interesting statement made by Alex O'Connor as it relates to the question of, does evolution disprove God? And the reason I say well is because when you're asked that question, it makes you think, man, there's so much to that. I can't just answer that in a nutshell, although we're going to see Alex O'Connor kind of answer it in a nutshell as it relates to the accumulative case that can be built against creationism. And what I'm going to do on the back end is I'm going to give some evidence why I believe natural selection and evolution, it entails, or at least suggests, that there is some designing mind behind this guided process of DNA replication. And I'm not just quoting myself, I'm quoting microbiologists, one that being, I believe his name is Michael Denton, and The Return of the God Hypothesis by Stephen C. Myers. And then also I'm going to be quoting from, what's his name, Richard Dawkins. How did I even forget that name for a second? But his book, The God Delusion, I will be also quoting something from him. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch this video of what Alex O'Connor has to say, who is a very prominent and making his way up in the ranks as it relates to philosophy and his ways of thinking. We're going to see what he has to say about this, and then we're going to get into the comments and suggestions of other things as it relates to the accumulative case that can be built for both sides. So with that being said, let's watch the video.
And I don't know how often this is actually like put this way by atheists, but it's the way that I've got it here is just evolution disproves God.
Well,
do you think, is that even a slogan? Would you even say that, like, any atheist even, like, is this a caricature?
There have been atheists that say that, but I don't think you would find most, okay, you might hear it said in the same way that somebody might say, like, the existence of trees proves God, which on its own sounds ridiculous, but maybe they actually mean something very specific by this. Maybe they think that the biological matter in trees has, or
they mean that trees are contingent,
or they mean trees are exactly right. Like that trees prove God's existence because trees are contingent beings, and you have the contingency argument. Like, okay, so technically, yeah, like maybe it might be a good argument to say, look at the trees, God must exist, right? Because what you mean by that is, like, look, here's a contingent object.
Yeah.
In the same way, someone might say that evolution causes a lot of problems for Christianity, and in such a way that I think these problems are sufficient to make Christianity more likely false. You could condense that into evolution disproves Christianity, but it depends on what's meant here. So for myself, I'd rather say something like the process of evolution by natural selection specifically is good evidence against the existence of a good God for a few reasons. There are lots of problems. For a start, the fact that suffering is so embedded into the process of natural selection. As I said the other day, survival of the fittest assumes the death and destruction of the unfit. It's built into the very system. The whole way that this pantheon of life came about is through a process that necessitated and involved incredible levels of suffering for unthinkable numbers of years. So there's this problem of evil from natural selection. It's not just the fact that there's evil existing, but that God seems to have chosen a mechanism that has suffering built into it, when at least feasibly he seems to have been able to do it through other means. He could have just popped us into existence. A lot of people think maybe he couldn't have done. There are, of course, responses to these, but so that's one problem. Another problem is the fact that, for example, human beings are supposed to be special. At least this might not be evidence against God, but against something like Christianity or any religion that thinks humans are special. You can resurrect all of the evolutionary tree. If you think about a human over here, all the way over to a fish over here, and there's like this evolutionary tree that connects them. If you resurrect all of the dead intermediaries and you send them all on a line, every life that's ever existed, you stand it all in one long line. You start with a human. You go human, 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 and that goes on for 100 billion humans. And then they're starting to look a bit more kind of ape-like. Right? It's like, okay, so you've got a kind of apish, maybe a bit chimpanzee, somewhere along the lines. And there's no point at which, like, a chimpanzee is stood next to a human. There's no point at which, like, you know, cow is stood next to a whale or something, or indeed a crocodile next to a duck. That's not how it works. To be a Christian, to say that human beings are special, you need to think that God can just draw this line somewhere, that you have this one creature that gives birth to another creature, which is, for all intents and purposes, identical to that creature. But this one is subject to the moral law and qualifies for eternal life, but its mother doesn't. That seems strange. Now, of course, you can just say that this is what it means to breathe life into Adam and Eve. There was just sort of arbitrarily chosen this point at which they said, okay, you've got this kind of like pre-hominid ape that gives birth to another pre-hominid ape. And God just goes like, okay, you're a human now. And suddenly they're like rational and can abstract or something. You can say that, but it seems strange, right? It seems like this is a problem that needs to be solved. Of course, also, we're still evolving. It's not like evolution is a thing that happened in the past. It's often spoken of in that manner, but it's still occurring. In a few 100,000 years, human beings will probably have evolved quite a significant amount. If you talk about millions of years, then it will have evolved even more. And so if we're made in the image of God, is there like some point at which we cease to be in his image? If we change so much that we're nothing like our human ancestors, are we still made in the image of God? Is there like this kind of time period that exists in like a bubble? Of course, you could just say that God is going to intervene and final judgment is going to come before that occurs. But, we've been waiting quite a long time already. And I think that the writers of the Gospels seem to imply that they thought it was happening fairly soon. Of course, what does soon mean to God? I think it would be a bit unfair if he told humans that it was happening soon, by which he meant something like, 2,000, 3,000 years. But, what's that to God? I think that would be a bit misleading. But of course, you can take these responses. You can say that God just breathed life into a random sort of hominid, apish ancestor. You could just say that God will intervene before we've evolved past being recognizably human. But these seem, again, quite ad hoc. So there's that problem. And that problem is specifically raised by the fact that we share a common ancestor with other animals. The fact that there's so much suffering embedded. I think there might be a few other problems. But these to me do provide evidence against God. They do provide good reason to doubt the existence of God. And so,
wouldn't the second one just be an argument against Christianity?
Oh, yeah, sorry, excuse me.
Okay.
You're right. The second one would not be an argument against a creator or something.
Yeah.
But of course, if you're imagining...
But the first one, the natural selection, suffering.
Again, that would be an argument against a good God. You can imagine an indifferent or malicious God.
Or they could be a good God and just impotent. They could be...
This is true, yeah. So it doesn't quite... And this is why I would certainly hesitate to say evolution disproves God, right? But does evolution by natural selection provide evidence against a good God? Yes. Does it provide evidence against Christianity? I think so. Is it enough on its own to disprove Christianity? Probably not. I don't think so. Is it enough to disprove God? Certainly not. So evolution doesn't disprove God, but at least in some context, it does provide good evidence.
Some evidence.
Yeah. Because this is the confusion that happens. A lot of people say, well, look, there seems to be this caricature of the dialogue that an atheist will say, no, we have evolution now. We've got no need for God. And then the Christian comes along and says, what do you mean like evolution has disproved God? There are all these kinds of responses. There are all these reasons. God could have chosen evolution as his method. And so it doesn't disprove God. But we don't have to work in extremes here. It's not does it disprove God or not. It's like, does it provide good evidence against particular claims about particular gods?
Okay, so first let's just go ahead and give a little breakdown as it relates to some of the points that Alex O'Connor makes in relation to this question. So one, speaking of natural selection, Alex explains the problem of suffering as being very prevalent throughout all structures of life, right? And he states that this mechanism of natural selection, it likely disproves a good God. Not that there isn't a God, rather it disproves that there is a good God because of this process of suffering that he allows his creation to undergo, right? So number two, he also mentions the belief of humans sharing common ancestors with apes in this evolutionary chain or line of descendants. And what's tied or connected to that is the idea of humans sharing common ancestors. It has to do with similarities in DNA of both humans and apes. Those who reject God see these similarities as a common ancestor. And again, those who reject God, they see these similarities as a common ancestor. You look back all the way over here and you got this chain or this line of transmission of evolution, right? And then as it relates to those who believe in God, they see the similarities as God being a common creator. again, as God being a common creator, because these things are not connected all the way in this evolutionary line. Rather, they share a similar blueprint as it relates to this DNA structure that is within these different body plans, organ structures, and stuff like that. And again, this doesn't entail a common descent in an evolutionary sense, that being those that believe the creationist side of this. And there's great arguments and debates that can take place for why creationists believe this to be the case. Now, here are some of my initial thoughts upon listening to this video. And the first thing that I thought was it had to do with origins, okay? Science shows everything in the universe began to exist at a point in time, even human beings, right? Even DNA replication. And when you presuppose some things to be true, you're going to start yourself on a poor foundation. And what I mean by that is, if you are not looking at what occurred back here and you're going to skip all of these things or understanding these things as it relates to origins or getting closer to a point in time of history starting, and you don't have a core foundation as it relates to why you believe what you believe back here, you're oftentimes presupposing certain things when you get way up here. So sometimes you got to go back a little bit, right? Now, the next thing that came to my mind was the argument of fine-tuning and how the fundamental constants are dependent upon each other in order for life to exist and to be as it is. And this is a strong argument on the side for creationists, and I would encourage you and highly encourage you to look into it if you haven't heard of it before. But now back to evolution by natural selection. This is speaking of biology and DNA replication, which will lead us back to the discussion of natural selection. And another thing that I thought upon listening to Alex speak was something very interesting about DNA replication. And this is something that's going to be explained by a philosopher of science who graduated with a PhD from Cambridge University. His name is Stephen C. Myers, who wrote the Return of the God hypothesis. Dr. Myers starts us off by talking about protein folds. And the definition of a protein fold is a protein fold refers to the three-dimensional structure of a protein that is formed by the specific arrangement and interactions of amino acid sequence. Protein folds represent the smallest unit of structural innovation in living systems. Now, with that being said, establishing the sequence of DNA is key to understanding the function of genes and other parts of the genome. Now, in page 199 of Dr. Meyer's book, he speaks of protein folds in the building blocks of life within proteins and amino acids, which play an instrumental role in protein replication. When speaking of evolution by natural selection, Alex mentions we are dealing with a set of probabilities. This is what Alex said, and that being how probable is natural selection to replicate proteins to bring about functional organisms. Before I explain what Dr. Myers has to say, I'll give a brief summary of what he has to say about the improbability of amino acids being able to arrange themselves by chance or without a guiding hand, aka a designer. Now, within DNA, there are many complexities that are dependent upon one another, an example being a chain of amino acids. The larger this chain of transmission of amino acids within DNA is to build a protein, the more improbable is the functionality or its ability to create meaning within the cell. Within DNA, what we see is a chain of amino acids being built in sequence, and these amino acids are lined up one after the other. So let me give an example, and kind of the same example that Stephen C. Myers is going to give, but sometimes replication in reiteration, it can deeper solidify this understanding of the complexities within DNA. So what Dr. Myers is going to do is he's going to explain the steps that is taken to build a protein fold as it relates to replication to further the sustenance and replication for this organism that is existing and living. So he uses an example of a small protein fold with 150 different sequence spaces for amino acids. So let me give an example and break it down. To build a protein fold, you need various amounts of amino acids in a small chain of 150, okay? The first sequence space is going to be here, boom. And 1 out of 20 different amino acids can fit within this sequence space. The next space is 2 out of the 150. And again, 1 out of 20 different amino acids can fit there. And then the same goes for the 3 all the way down to the 150. And what you're going to see is the further down you go, the more improbable it is for all of these amino acids to fit and work in accordance to one another. Because Each one is dependent upon one another, just like the argument of fine-tuning. The fundamental constants are dependent upon one another, and if one variation was just off the slightest, you wouldn't have life as it is. And the same is true within the cell. So Michael Denton, I believe is his name, the microbiologist, he did these probabilities, because again, we're speaking of probabilities as even Alex brings up and talks about. So if you have 1 out of 20 that can fit in the first space, that's 1 out of 20 different possibilities that if you press a button that you're going to get that specific amino acid. But then when you get over here, that number grows a lot. And this is where I had to take a piece of paper because I'm not a mathematician. So for the second sequence right here, it has to work with this one. And the chances of this 1 out of 20 working with this 1 out of 20, that number begins to grow in probability and becomes more unlikely for it to work by chance. And that number in the second sequence space, it's 20 to the second power, which means there's 400 different variations or ways that you can make this second amino acid in this space work in accordance with this one. And then when you go to the third one, to the third sequence, again, this third space has to work in accordance with the other two that were selected before that one. And that probability is 20 to the third power, which means there's 800 different possibilities. Okay, I'm going to give one more. Okay, it's 20 to the fourth power, which would be the fourth sequence space. This is 160,000 different possibilities that just 4 sequence spaces for these amino acids to create this protein fold to bring about this DNA replication has to bring anything of meaning, right? So when you look at the probability, it's more likely that a designing mind or a guiding hand is going to be able to fulfill what this is and what this process of DNA is doing. Now, the first thing Dr. Myers will talk about is nucleotide bases. Bases are the part of DNA that store information and give DNA the ability to encode phenotype, which is visible traits. Dr. Myers explains how we run into the problem of combinatorial inflation. Now, on page 199 of his book that I've quoted, Myers states, he says, "For a sequence of bases in DNA of any significant length, there were likely vastly more ways of arranging nucleotide bases that would not produce a functional protein than there were ways of arranging nucleotide bases that would." The time it takes to cycle through possible combinations within this evolutionary process also needs to be addressed, as Myers will address, in order to predict this probability. That being the number of opportunities that natural selection has available to do its search for functional to non-functional sequences. And what we mean by functional in comparison to non-functional is there's different sequences that these amino acids or different parts of DNA replication can take. But there's only functional ways that are going to be formulated in order for it to bring about a means to an end or to be sufficient to produce adequate replication, or else it could degrade the system or the organism. Now I'd like to read page 202, where Dr. Myers states, "The key isn't just the number of total combinations that have to be searched, but the ratio of number of combinations that will open the lock to the total number of combinations." So again, it's the ratio of functional to non-functional sequences that determines this difficulty. By functional to non-functional, we mean the way to produce replication. Next, Myers quotes a study done by molecular biologist Douglas Axe to explain the rarity of functional genes and proteins in combinatorial spaces. That being to determine the relevant ratio of functional to non-functional sequences. And again, let me break it down one more time because this is some deep stuff. There's vastly more ways that you can arrange these amino acids or different process of DNA replication. There's more ways that you can arrange these things in order to bring about degradation or completely eliminate the organism. That would be non-functional. Now, functional, there's less ways that you can formulate these different processes of replication to bring about the survival of the thing that is being naturally selected, right? So again, that's what it's meant when we're talking about functional to non-functional. And this is where probabilities come in again, because this is what we're comparing. If there's more ways that we can formulate these different processes of replication, and if there's more ways to do that than there are for ways to replicate it to bring about the life of this organism, then probability says it's more likely that it wasn't done by chance and that it was a designing mind, is what the creationists would say, okay? So now let's go ahead and read from page 204 of The Return of the God Hypothesis, where Douglas Axe says this: using a sampling technique called site-directed mutagenesis, for every one DNA sequence that generates a short functional protein of just 150 amino acids in length, there are 10 to the 77th power non-functional combinations that will not perform a stable three-dimensional protein fold capable of performing a specific biological function. So to put this into context, there are only 10 to the 65th power of atoms in our galaxy. Could random genetic mutation effectively search a space of possibilities that large in the time available in even the Cambrian explosion or even the entire history of Earth? For an organism to produce a new organism, opportunity to mutate genes through the passing on to offspring has to occur in order to pass on a new gene sequence. But out of the 3.85 billion years of an estimated 10 to the 40th power of organisms that have existed throughout this 3 billion year process or timeline, there hasn't been enough time for these organisms to produce enough replication through natural selection. So again, it's important to understand that the probability for this DNA replication or this amino acid replication, it's very improbable, but that's not the only thing that we need to evaluate, is what Stephen C. Myers is saying. We also need to evaluate the amount of time that natural selection has to be able to cycle through this process and create this different type of mutational structure. So now I'm going to quote a rather longer part from Stephen Myers' book from page 205 and also 207, where he says, "This means we would have had at most about 10 to the 40th opportunities to mutate a gene that might ultimately produce a new protein fold. 10 to the 40th represents a tiny fraction of 10 to the 77th, which again represents the amount of non-functional combinations in comparison to functional. That means that at most about 10 to the 40th such opportunities to mutate a gene that might ultimately produce a new protein fold could have occurred. Yet 10 to the 40th power represents only a tiny fraction of 10 to the 77th, the number of non-functional sequences corresponding to each protein fold of modest length. Indeed, the fraction 10 to the 40th power divided by 10 to the 77th power equals 1 part in 10 to the 37th power, or 1 part in 10 trillion times a trillion times a trillion to be exact. This means for one relatively modest-sized novel protein fold to arise, the mechanism of random mutation and natural selection would have time to search just a tiny fraction of the total number of relevant sequences. In other words, the number of trials available to the evolutionary process turns out to be incredibly small in relation to the number of possible sequences that need to be searched. Or, to put it differently, the size of the relevant spaces that need to be searched by the evolutionary process dwarfs the time available for searching, even taking into account life's 3.85 billion year history. It follows that the mechanism of random mutation and natural selection has not had enough time to generate or search but a minuscule fraction, 110 trillion to be precise, of total number of possible nucleotide base or amino acid sequences corresponding to a single protein fold. It is therefore overwhelmingly more likely than not that a random mutational search would have failed to produce even one new functional information-rich DNA sequence capable of coding for one new protein fold in the entire history of life on Earth. Consequently, the hypothesis that such a random search succeeded is more likely to be false than true. And of course, building new animals would require the creation of many new proteins and protein folds, not just one. It follows that the standard neo-Darwinism mechanism does not provide an adequate explanation for the origin of the genetic information necessary to produce the major innovations in biological form that have arisen in the history of life on Earth. Now, the chance of natural selection being responsible for our biology is far to none. But something I would love to point out from Alex is him saying not everything is as black and white. And what he means by that is this accumulative case can be brought from both sides And it's not just one thing, just like the evidence that I'm presenting right now. It's not just this one thing that leads a creationist to believe that there is a God. Rather, it's the accumulative case that can be compiled to push us in a certain direction to put our faith in that evidence. And one thing I would encourage you to do is to look at the evidence of the resurrection. That's a big part of the accumulative case for Christianity. And even Alex himself admits and willingly admits that that's a very strong part of the case for Christianity. There's a lot that can be talked about, but let's keep going. The last thing I'll touch on is the topic of the Cambrian explosion. And I would like to quote something Richard Dawkins says in his book, The God Delusion. And this can be found on page 151 as it relates to the things that we have already been speaking of. Richard Dawkins quotes, "The creationists are right that if genuinely irreducible complexity could be properly demonstrated, it would wreck Darwin's theory. Darwin himself said as much. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would actually break down, but I can find no such case." As we have already seen through the mathematical testing done relating to the amount of time evolution has had to work in history of all living organisms, it has not had enough time to bring such complexity through Darwin's said successive slight modifications. And moreover, we find evidence to the contrary of Darwin's form of evolution within the Cambrian explosion. As Stephen C. Myers explains, he quotes, "The abrupt new bodily structures found within the Cambrian age have no ancestral connection to any living organism of the past. Out of the 100 or more years of new findings of fossils, there has been no connection or relationship to one another whatsoever." Myers explains these organisms flip Darwin's tree of evolution upside down. Now, with that being said, I would like to address one more thing. Within the accumulative case, the atheist can talk about the gene pool as it relates to certain genes winning out within individuals. And the theist can add to that, explaining the idea of genetic degradation within our cells or within our genes and how this happened upon the fall of mankind. And the influence of these genes or the morality that we practice can be influenced by a good or a bad spirit. My point in bringing this up is to show that if we start the conversation at this point, that being discussing the gene pool versus the influence of spirits, we may very often be overlooking some of the arguments that have to do with the origins of why we can even have the conversations of gene pool versus the spiritual influence in the first place. And a part of the accumulative case is to evaluate all the evidence we have. And speaking of origins, it seems as though the theist is working with a more rational approach to explaining origins and the fine-tuning of biology through microbiologists and mathematicians and explaining why this is the case. And same for the fine-tuning argument of the universe. Now, this is not me attacking atheists or me sitting here being prideful and saying I can't learn something from an atheist. Okay, I learn stuff from Alex all the time. But what I am saying is that as it relates to origins, it seems like there are very important foundational aspects that only creationism, theism, or Christianity can explain far better than any other atheist perspective ever could. So indeed, the accumulative case is very important for both sides, that being the side of creationism and theism. And the accumulative case should create a deeper work of humility in both sides so we can come closer to understanding what the truth is. Because when you come in with all these presuppositional ideas, you're not going to be able to put yourself in the shoes of what the creationist or the theist is going to understand, and you are limiting yourself. So I hope this video inspired you and encouraged you or gave you some things to think about, some things to reevaluate and to consider as it relates to some presuppositional things that you might have came here with. And with that being said, peace out.